The winter of 1943 arrived in Detroit with the kind of cold that made steel brittle and turned breath into frozen clouds. In a cramped apartment above a bakery on Michigan Avenue, 23-year-old Margaret Eleanor Hayes sat at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of weak coffee, staring at a letter that would change everything. The envelope bore the official seal of the Women Air Force Service pilots, and inside, typed on crisp military letterhead, was an invitation that most women could only dream of. But Margaret wasn't most women. She was the daughter of an aircraft mechanic who had taught her to read blueprints before she could read books, who had let her crawl into engine compartments when other girls were learning to bake pies. Her father had died 2 years earlier, his lungs destroyed by years of inhaling metal dust and aviation fuel, but he had left her something more valuable than money. He had left her an understanding of machines that bordered on intimate, a sixth sense for what made metal sink to the sky, or fall silent forever. The call to serve came at a moment when America was bleeding. Young men were dying in places with names that twisted American tongues: Guadalcanal, Kasserine Pass, the black waters of the Atlantic where U-boats prowled like wolves. The factories of Detroit had transformed overnight. Assembly lines that once produced Chevrolets now churned out tanks and bombers. Margaret had been working at the Willow Run plant, where 24 Liberators rolled off the line with mechanical precision, one every 63 minutes. She had watched these silver giants take shape, had seen the rivets driven home by women whose husbands and brothers were fighting overseas. But watching was no longer enough. The WASP program was her chance to do more than build the machines of war. It was her chance to fly them. 3 days later, she stood on a train platform with a single suitcase and her father's leather flight jacket, the one he had worn when he barnstormed across county fairs in the 1920s. The jacket smelled of oil and old adventures, and when she put it on, she felt him standing beside her, his rough hand on her shoulder, telling her what he had always told her since she was small enough to sit in his lap while he sketched engine modifications. Do what others say cannot be done. The journey to Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, took 3 days of rattling trains and restless nights. Margaret watched America pass by her window, the frozen lakes of Michigan giving way to the endless plains of the Midwest, then the harsh beauty of Texas, where the land stretched flat and unforgiving under a sky so big it made her feel both infinitely small and strangely invincible. Sweetwater was a shock after Detroit. The training base sat in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by scrub brush and red dirt, where the wind blew constantly and carried the smell of oil and aviation fuel and the dreams of 500 women who had come from every corner of America to learn to fly military aircraft. The barracks were Spartan, the food was terrible, and the training was designed to break anyone who wasn't absolutely committed. Margaret loved every minute of it. She flew Stearmans and at 6 Texans, learning to navigate by stars and instruments, to recover from spins and stalls, to land in crosswinds that would make experienced pilots sweat. But what set her apart wasn't just her flying. It was what she did on the ground, in the hours when other women slept or wrote letters home. She spent those hours in the maintenance hangars, talking to mechanics, studying the aircraft with the same intensity her father had once shown her. I know our audience is made up of intelligent and discerning people like you, those who appreciate stories that go beyond the surface, that reveal the hidden corners of history, where courage took unexpected forms. If you value content that brings these forgotten heroes to light, consider subscribing to this channel. Help us continue telling the stories that deserve to be remembered. By the spring of 1944, Margaret had earned her silver wings and received orders that sent her to Long Beach, California. The assignment was straightforward on paper: ferry duty, moving aircraft from factories to air bases across the country. But the reality was far more complex. These weren't training planes. They were combat aircraft, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, and increasingly, the new P-51 Mustangs that were beginning to tip the balance in the air war over Europe. The Mustang was a revelation, sleek and deadly, with lines that suggested speed even when it sat motionless on the tarmac. It had been designed by North American Aviation to British specifications, powered by the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that gave a performance that made other fighters obsolete. It could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything the Germans had, and in the hands of a skilled pilot, It was nearly unstoppable. Margaret fell in love with a Mustang the first time she flew one. The way the stick responded to the lightest touch. The way the engine sang a note of pure power. The way it cut through the air like a blade through silk. But love didn't make her blind. If anything, it made her see more clearly. And what she saw troubled her deeply. On her third ferry flight, delivering a P-51B from the factory in Inglewood to an air base in Nebraska, Margaret encountered something that shouldn't have happened. At 20,000 feet, cruising over the Rockies with the sun turning the mountains below into sharp shadows and golden peaks, the aircraft began to behave strangely. It wasn't catastrophic, nothing that would show up in an official report, but there was a vibration in the controls, a subtle loss of responsiveness that made the plane feel sluggish, as if it was fighting against invisible resistance. She compensated instinctively, adjusting her trim and throttle, nursing the aircraft to its destination. When she landed, she spent an hour inspecting the plane, crawling over every inch of it while mechanics watched with barely concealed amusement. A woman pilot was one thing, tolerated because the war demanded it. A woman pilot who thought she understood aircraft engineering was something else entirely, an affront to the natural order that most men accepted only because they had no choice. She found what she was looking for near the tail section, where the control cables ran through fairings and connected to the elevator and rudder. The routing wasn't wrong exactly, but it wasn't optimal. There was a point where the cables made an unnecessarily sharp angle, creating friction that built up over time, especially at high altitudes where temperatures dropped far below zero and metal contracted in ways that amplified every imperfection. That night, in her small room at the bachelor officer's quarters, Margaret did something that would have earned her a reprimand if anyone had known. She took out her father's old drafting tools and began to sketch, working by the light of a single lamp, drawing and redrawing until she had a solution. It was elegant in its simplicity, a matter of repositioning two mounting brackets and rerouting the cables through a slightly different path that would eliminate the friction point. The modification would take perhaps 2 hours to implement, would add no weight to the aircraft, and would cost virtually nothing. But it would, she calculated carefully, improve control response by approximately 8% at high altitude. In a dogfight where victory could be measured in fractions of a second, where pilots fought at the edge of consciousness in thin air, that 8% might mean the difference between life and death. She knew this with the same certainty she knew the sun would rise over the California coast the next morning. What she didn't know was whether anyone would listen to her. The next week, she submitted her proposal through official channels, a detailed technical document, complete with diagrams and calculations, addressed to the Engineering Review Board at Wright Field in Ohio. The response came back within 10 days, faster than she had expected, and far more dismissive than she had feared. The modification was deemed unnecessary. The current cable routing met all specifications. The minimal improvement in control response did not justify the expenditure of resources or the delay in aircraft production. The letter was signed by a colonel whose name she didn't recognize, and it ended with a sentence that burned itself into her memory. The board appreciates your enthusiasm, but respectfully suggests that ferry pilots focus on flying aircraft rather than attempting to redesign them. Margaret read the letter 3 times, feeling something cold and hard settle in her chest. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was a recognition of a wall she had run into before, would run into again, a wall built not of logic or evidence, but of assumptions about who had the right to speak and who had the duty to listen. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her footlocker, beneath her spare uniforms and her father's flight jacket. Then she went back to flying. But she didn't forget. Through the summer of 1944, she continued to ferry Mustangs across the country. And with each flight, she paid attention to the way the aircraft behaved, the way that subtle vibration manifested in different conditions, how it affected different pilots in different ways. She talked to other WASP pilots, carefully, casually, asking if they had noticed anything unusual. Most hadn't, or hadn't thought it worth mentioning. But a few had, especially the ones with a mechanical background, the ones who understood that small problems in engineering could become large problems in combat. She kept notes, documenting every instance, building a case that she knew might never be heard. Meanwhile, the war in Europe was reaching a critical phase. Allied bombers were pounding Germany around the clock, British Lancasters by night, American flying fortresses, and Liberators by day, turning cities into rubble and factories into twisted metal. But the bombers were paying a terrible price. German fighters, especially the new Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s flown by experienced pilots, were exacting a brutal toll. Losses were unsustainable, and a strategic bombing campaign was in danger of grinding to a halt. The solution was the Mustang, which had the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, something no other fighter could do. But even the Mustang had its limitations, and in the brutal arithmetic of air combat, every limitation could be measured in dead airmen. In September, Margaret's world shifted again. She was reassigned to a new duty, one that came without explanation or warning. Instead of ferrying aircraft cross-country, she would be based at Eglin Field in Florida, working with a special test unit that evaluated aircraft performance under combat conditions. It was unusual for a WASP to receive such an assignment, and Margaret suspected that someone somewhere had looked at her file, had seen her maintenance background and her rejected proposal, and had decided to either prove her wrong or give her a chance to prove herself right. She never found out which. Eglin Field in September was hot and humid, with afternoon thunderstorms that turned the sky black and the runways into rivers. The test unit occupied a separate section of the base, away from the training squadrons, where pilots and engineers worked together to push aircraft to their limits. There were male pilots here, combat veterans who had flown missions over Europe and the Pacific, who had seen friends die and had killed enemies whose faces they would never forget. They looked at Margaret with the same skepticism she had encountered everywhere. But here, at least, the skepticism was based on ability rather than assumptions. If she could fly and if she could contribute, they would accept her. If not, they would make her life miserable until she quit. She understood the terms and accepted them without complaint. Her first week was a test, deliberately designed to be overwhelming. They had her fly a different aircraft every day, sometimes multiple aircraft in a single day. Mustangs, Thunderbolts, Lightnings, even an early jet fighter that felt less like flying and more like being strapped to a barely controlled explosion. After each flight, she had provided detailed debrief, not just about performance, but about feel, about the subtle things that didn't show up in instruments, but that a pilot knew in their bones. She excelled at this, drawing on her mechanical knowledge to articulate exactly what she was experiencing and why it mattered. By the end of the second week, the skepticism had faded, replaced by something like respect. By the end of the month, they were asking her opinion on modifications and listening to her answers. It was in October that she finally had the chance she had been waiting for. A new batch of P-51DS had arrived from the factory, equipped with a bubble canopy that gave pilots unobstructed visibility, a crucial advantage in combat. The aircraft were scheduled for a series of high-altitude performance tests, simulating the conditions pilots would face over Germany. Margaret was assigned to fly 3 of these tests, pushing the Mustangs to their operational ceiling of 40,000 feet, where the air was so thin that pilots had to breathe pure oxygen, and where any mistake could send an aircraft into an uncontrollable spin. She flew the first test by the book, following the prescribed profile exactly, documenting everything. The aircraft performed within specifications, but she felt again that subtle vibration in the controls, that slight sluggishness that meant the pilot was fighting the plane instead of flying it. After she landed, she found the chief engineer, a gruff captain from Oklahoma named Jack Morrison, who had designed modifications for half the fighters in the Army Air Force's inventory. She explained what she had felt, and more importantly, she explained why it mattered. Morrison listened without interrupting, his weathered face unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked her a single question. "Can you fix it?" That night, with Morrison's grudging permission and the help of 2 mechanics who were curious enough to stay late, Margaret implemented her modification on one of the test aircraft. It took 4 hours instead of 2, because they had to fabricate custom brackets, and because Morrison insisted on checking every step of the work. But when they were finished, the cable routing was exactly as she had envisioned it months earlier, smooth and clean, with no unnecessary friction points. The next morning, she flew the modified aircraft alongside an unmodified one, conducting identical tests at identical altitudes. The difference was immediately apparent. The modified Mustang responded more crisply, required less input from the pilot, felt alive in a way the other aircraft didn't. The improvement in control response was measurable, documented in the instruments, but more importantly, it was tangible, something that could be felt in the hands and understood instinctively. Morrison flew the aircraft himself that afternoon, then had 3 other test pilots fly it. All of them reported the same thing. This was better, significantly better, in ways that mattered when you were fighting for your life 6 miles above enemy territory. Morrison submitted a report to Wright Field recommending immediate implementation of the modification across all P-51 production. He included Margaret's original proposal, her documentation from months of observations, and the test data from Eglin. He also included a cover letter that was blunt even by military standards, stating that the rejection of this modification had been an error in judgment and that further delay would constitute negligence. The response this time was different. Within 3 weeks, the modification was approved for immediate implementation, not just on new production aircraft, but as a retrofit for existing Mustangs in combat theaters. Margaret thought that would be the end of it, that she would continue her test work at Eglin, while her modification was incorporated into thousands of aircraft across the world. She thought her contribution to the war effort would be measured in engineering reports and performance data. Important perhaps, but invisible to everyone except a few specialists who understood what the numbers meant. She was wrong about that, spectacularly wrong, in ways that would reshape her entire understanding of what service meant and what she was capable of achieving. In November 1944, a letter arrived from the War Department, not addressed to Eglin Field, but to her personally, forwarded through channels that bypassed her commanding officer. The letter was brief and formal, requesting her presence in Washington for a meeting with unspecified officials regarding a matter of national importance. There were no details, no explanations, just travel orders and a date 2 weeks away. Margaret made the journey to Washington in a fog of confusion and speculation. The Capitol in late autumn was cold and gray, the streets filled with people in uniform, thousands of them, moving with the purposeful urgency of a nation at war. She reported to an anonymous office building near the Pentagon, where a nervous lieutenant led her through security checks and down corridors that seemed designed to disorient. Finally, she was shown into a conference room where 3 men in Air Force's uniform sat waiting, 2 colonels and a general whose stars gleamed against his shoulders. They introduced themselves with names she immediately forgot, too overwhelmed by the situation to process anything beyond the basic fact that she was in serious trouble or serious opportunity, and she had no idea which. The general spoke first, his voice carrying the flat vowels of the Midwest and the authority of someone who had commanded men in combat. Lieutenant Hayes, he said, and the use of her rank reminded her that despite everything, she was still just a pilot in auxiliary service that wasn't even officially part of the military. We have a problem that we believe you can help us solve. Your modification to the P-51 control system has been implemented across our fighter groups in Europe. Initial reports suggest that it's having exactly the impact you predicted. Pilots are reporting better control response, especially in high-altitude combat. We're seeing a measurable improvement in combat effectiveness. But we have a second problem, one that your modification inadvertently highlighted. He paused, and one of the colonels opened a folder and slid a photograph across the table. It showed a P-51 Mustang, but this one was different, painted in a model camouflage pattern she didn't recognize, with unusual bulges under the wings and what looked like additional fuel tanks. This is a Soviet modification to the Mustang. The general continued. We've been providing them with aircraft through Lend-Lease, and their engineers have been making their own improvements. Some of their modifications are crude, but some are brilliant. They're facing different combat conditions than we are, different tactics, different enemies. We want to know what they've learned, and more importantly, we want to ensure that our aircraft can match or exceed anything the Soviets are doing. The Germans are collapsing, Lieutenant. Anyone with eyes can see that. But after the Germans are defeated, the situation in Europe will be complicated. We need to maintain technological superiority, not just over our enemies, but over our allies. That's where you come in. What the general was proposing was unprecedented. Margaret would be part of a small team sent to the Soviet Union, ostensibly provide technical assistance on the Lend-Lease aircraft, but actually to evaluate Soviet modifications and determine whether any of them should be adopted by American forces. It was intelligence work disguised as engineering consultation, and it was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with flying. The Soviet Union was an ally by necessity, not by choice, and the relationship was strained by mutual suspicion and competing visions for the post-war world. Americans who went there operated under constant surveillance, their movements restricted, their communications monitored. People had disappeared into Soviet prisons for reasons that made sense only to Stalin's security apparatus. The general made it clear that she could decline, that this was voluntary, that her service up to this point had been exemplary, and refusal would carry no consequences. He also made it clear, without saying it directly, that acceptance would mean she was serving her country in ways that few people would ever know about or understand. Margaret thought about her father, about the letter from Wright Field that had dismissed her modification as unnecessary, about the thousands of pilots who were flying into combat with aircraft that were now 8% more responsive because she had refused to be silent. She thought about what it meant to serve, really serve, when service required risking not just your life but your identity, becoming someone who did necessary things in dark places. She said yes before she fully understood what she was agreeing to. 3 weeks later, she was on a military transport flying across the Atlantic, part of a convoy that included bombers being delivered to Soviet forces under Lend-Lease. The flight took them through Iceland and then across the Norwegian Sea, skirting German-occupied Norway, before turning south toward Murmansk. It was December, and the Arctic winter had locked the northern world in darkness that lasted 20 hours a day. They landed at a Soviet air base that was little more than a frozen runway carved out of tundra, surrounded by wooden buildings that looked like they might blow away in the next strong wind. The cold was unimaginable, 60 degrees below zero, a cold that made her lungs ache and turn exposed skin black with frostbite in minutes. The Soviets who met them were polite but distant, following protocols that had obviously been dictated from Moscow. Margaret and her team, 3 engineers and a translator who spoke Russian with a Brooklyn accent, were housed in a barracks that was slightly warmer than the outside air, but not by much. They slept in their clothes, huddled under blankets that smelled of mothballs and old sweat, and woke each morning wondering if this would be the day they learned something worth the misery of being here. The work began slowly, hindered by language barriers and Soviet reluctance to share information. They were allowed to inspect the modified Mustangs, but only with Soviet engineers present, and only after lengthy negotiations about what could and couldn't be photographed or measured. Margaret quickly realized that the real challenge wasn't technical, it was human. The Soviets had been fighting for 3 years, had seen their cities burned and their people slaughtered by the millions, had clawed their way back on the edge of annihilation through sheer brutal determination. They had learned lessons about warfare that Americans couldn't even imagine, and they weren't inclined to share those lessons with allies who had entered the war late, and who would leave when it was over, going home to a country that hadn't been touched by the destruction that had consumed Europe. It was a Soviet pilot who finally broke through the barriers, a woman named Yekaterina Budanova, who flew with one of the all-female fighter regiments that had become legendary for their ferocity in combat. Katia, as she insisted Margaret call her, had shot down 11 German aircraft before being shot down herself, surviving only because she managed to crash land in territory held by Soviet forces. She had burns across her face and hands, scars that would never fully heal, and she had lost 3 fingers on her left hand to frostbite after spending 2 days in the wreckage before being rescued. But she was back flying, because the Soviet Air Force needed every pilot who could still grip a stick, and because Katia couldn't imagine doing anything else. She found Margaret one evening in the barracks, appearing without warning or invitation, carrying a bottle of vodka that was probably worth more than a month's pay. They drank together, communicating more through gestures and laughter than through the limited Russian and English they shared. And then Katia began to talk, slowly, with the translator struggling to keep up, about what it meant to fly against the Luftwaf, to face pilots who had been flying combat missions in Spain, who had skills honed through years of war. She talked about fear, about the moment when you realized that the aircraft behind you was faster and better positioned, and that you had perhaps 3 seconds to do something brilliant or die. She talked about the modification Soviet engineers had made to their aircraft, not from any theoretical understanding, but from the brutal feedback loop of combat, where good ideas kept you alive and bad ideas got you killed. And she talked about Margaret's modification, which had reached Soviet Mustangs through the normal supply chain and which had already saved lives, including possibly her own. Over the next month, Margaret learned more about aircraft performance in combat than she had learned in all her previous training combined. Katia introduced her to other pilots, men and women who had flown hundreds of combat missions, who had insights about what worked and what didn't that no amount of testing could replicate. She learned about tactics the Luftwaf used, about how German pilots exploited every weakness in Allied aircraft, about the psychological warfare of combat, where confidence could matter as much as capability. And she learned about Soviet modifications to the Mustang, some of which were brilliant, and some of which were desperate improvisations born of necessity. The best of these modifications involved the gun sight system, a clever improvement that made targeting easier in the chaos of a dogfight. The worst involved attempts to increase firepower by adding additional machine guns, which threw off the aircraft's balance and made it unstable. Margaret documented everything, writing reports that would be classified for decades, reports that would influence aircraft design long after the war ended. But the most important thing she learned had nothing to do with engineering. She learned that the line between ally and enemy was thinner than she had imagined, that the war would end but the conflicts it revealed would persist, that she was part of something larger and darker than the simple narrative of good versus evil that Americans told themselves. She learned that serving her country sometimes meant doing things that troubled her conscience, gathering intelligence on people who trusted her, betraying friendships in the name of national security. It was a lesson that would haunt her for the rest of her life. In February 1945, she returned to the United States, flying back to the same frozen darkness she had entered through. She submitted her reports, was debriefed by intelligence officers who seemed more interested in Soviet military capabilities than in aircraft modifications, and was told in no uncertain terms that everything she had seen and done in Russia was classified and would remain classified indefinitely. Then, without ceremony or explanation, she was reassigned back to ferry duty, as if the previous 3 months had never happened. It should have felt like a demotion, a return to meaningless routine after doing work that actually mattered. But Margaret found herself grateful for it, grateful for the simplicity of flying aircraft from one place to another, for the absence of moral complexity, for the chance to be just a pilot again without the weight of secrets and duplicity. She flew through the spring of 1945 as the war in Europe reached its violent conclusion. She was in the air, delivering a Mustang to an East Coast air base, when the news came through on the radio that Hitler was dead and that Berlin had fallen. She was flying over Virginia when peace was declared in Europe, watching the sun set over the Blue Ridge Mountains, thinking about all the pilots who wouldn't see this moment, all the young men who had died in aircraft she had helped design, or improve, or understand. The war with Japan continued through the summer, growing more desperate and brutal with each week. Margaret flew missions that took her to the West Coast, where massive fleets of B-29 superfortresses were being prepared for missions over Japan, where rumors circulated about a new weapon that would end the war in ways no one could quite imagine. Then in August, the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and suddenly the war was over, ended not by invasion or starvation, but by physics, by the splitting of atoms and the release of energy that turned cities into shadows and ash. The end of the war brought changes that Margaret hadn't anticipated. The WASP program was disbanded almost immediately, its pilots released from service without benefits, without recognition, without the veteran status granted to male pilots who had done identical work. Margaret found herself back in Detroit, back in the apartment above the bakery, trying to figure out what came next for a woman whose skills were suddenly obsolete in a world that wanted women to return to domestic life and leave the adventures to men. She tried to get work as a pilot with the commercial airlines, but they weren't hiring women, not for a cockpit crew. She tried to get work as an engineer, but the factories that had welcomed female workers during the war were now laying them off to make room for returning servicemen. For 6 months, she drifted, working odd jobs, trying not to think about the fact that the most meaningful period of her life was over and that she would spend the rest of her days as a footnote in someone else's story. Then in March 1946, she received a phone call from Jack Morrison, the engineer from Eglin Field. He was working for North American Aviation in California, helping to design the next generation of fighter aircraft. They needed someone with her unique combination of skills, someone who understood both the theoretical and practical aspect of aircraft performance, someone who had seen combat conditions even if she had never fired a shot in anger. The job paid well, better than anything she could find in Detroit. More importantly, it was a chance to keep doing the work that mattered, to continue contributing to the field she loved even if the world had decided that women pilots were a wartime expedient to be forgotten as quickly as possible. She took the job and moved to California, to the sprawling suburbs of Los Angeles, where orange groves were being bulldozed to make room for housing developments, and where the aerospace industry was exploding with Cold War urgency. She worked on fighters that would never see combat, prototypes that pushed the boundaries of what was possible, aircraft that flew fast and sound, and carried weapons that could destroy entire cities. It was exciting work, important work, but it was also work that took place in offices and wind tunnels, removed from the visceral reality of flight. She missed fly with an ache that never quite faded, but she had learned to accept that some parts of her life were over, that you couldn't go back even if you wanted to. What she didn't know, what no one told her until much later, was that her modification to the P-51 had become standard on all production Mustangs after December 1944, and that American fighter pilots over Germany and later over Korea had benefited from those 8% better control responses in ways that saved lives and won battles. She didn't know that Soviet pilots, including Katia Budanova, had specifically requested American Mustangs with Hayes modification, or that intelligence reports credited her work with improving Allied air superiority in the final months of the European War. She didn't know any of this because no one thought to tell her, because her work was classified and her contributions were inconvenient to acknowledge in a post-war world that was busy writing women out of the story. It wasn't until 1977, more than 30 years after the war ended, that she learned the full truth. By then, she was 60 years old, retired from North American aviation, living in a small house in Pasadena with a garden she tended and books she read and memories she mostly kept to herself. A young historian researching the WASP program tracked her down, asking for an interview about her experiences. During that interview, over tea in her living room with afternoon light slanting to the windows, the historian showed her declassified documents that detail the impact of her modification, combat reports that mention it specifically, even a letter from a British pilot who had flown a modified Mustang over Berlin and who credited the improved controls with saving his life during a dogfight with German jets. Margaret read these documents slowly, her hand shaking slightly, not from age but from the sudden overwhelming weight of recognition. She had spent 3 decades thinking her wartime service had been a small thing, a minor contribution to a vast enterprise. Now she was learning that she had saved lives, dozens perhaps, maybe hundreds. She had made the aircraft better, had solved a problem that experienced engineers had dismissed, had proven that insight could come from unexpected places if people were willing to listen. The historian asked her how it felt to finally know the truth, to understand that her work had mattered in ways she had never imagined. Margaret thought about this carefully, looking out at her garden where roses were blooming in the California sun. She thought about her father, who had died believing that his daughter would be limited by a world that couldn't see past her gender. She thought about the letter from right field that had dismissed her as an enthusiastic amateur. She thought about Katia Budanova and the other Soviet pilots who had shared their vodka and their stories, and who had understood that skill transcended nationality and gender and all the artificial categories that people use to divide themselves. And then she answered, in a voice that was quiet but completely certain. It feels like I did exactly what I was supposed to do. I saw a problem and I fixed it. Everything else, the recognition or lack of it, the credit or anonymity, none of that was ever the point. The point was making the aircraft better so pilots could come home. If that happened, then my work was worthwhile regardless of whether anyone knew my name. The historian's book was published 2 years later, and included a chapter on Margaret Eleanor Hayes and her modification to the P-51 Mustang. The chapter was detailed and well-researched, drawing on declassified military documents and interviews with surviving WASP pilots and combat veterans. It presented Margaret as a pioneer, a woman who had broken barriers and made contributions that were only now being properly acknowledged. The book received modest attention, mostly within academic circles and among military history enthusiasts. Margaret read it once, carefully, making notes in the margins where details were incorrect or where the historian had misunderstood technical specifics. But she never sought additional publicity, never tried to capitalize on her newfound recognition. She had lived most of her life in obscurity, and she was comfortable there, more comfortable than she would have been in the spotlight that she had earned but never sought. She died in 1989, at the age of 68, from complications related to lung cancer, perhaps caused by the same chemical exposures that had killed her father decades earlier. Her funeral was small, attended by former colleagues from North American Aviation, and a few neighbors who knew her as the quiet woman who grew beautiful roses, and who sometimes mentioned having been a pilot during the war, though none of them quite believed her because it seemed so improbable. There was no military honor guard, no folded flag presented to grieving relatives, because the WASP pilots weren't officially recognized as veterans until 1977, and even then, the recognition was incomplete, begrudging, as if acknowledging their service somehow diminished the sacrifices of men. But the story doesn't end with her death, because the best stories never really end. They ripple outward, touching lives in ways that can't be predicted or controlled. In 2010, the WASP pilots were finally awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor Congress can bestow. The ceremony took place in the Capitol, with aging pilots in their 80s and 90s receiving recognition that came 65 years too late for most of their colleagues. Margaret wasn't there to receive her medal, but her name was read along with the others, one among more than 1,000 women who had served when their country needed them and who had been forgotten when convenience demanded it. And somewhere in that ceremony, in the reading of those names and the acknowledgement of those contributions, there was a sense that history was finally, incompletely, being corrected. The modifications Margaret designed are still used in aircraft today, not on P-51s, which belong to museums and airshow circuits, but on modern fighters where the principle she discovered, that smooth cable routing improves control response, remains fundamental to design. Engineering students at universities study her work without knowing her name, learning from her insights while remaining ignorant of the battles she fought to have those insights taken seriously. There's a certain injustice in that anonymity, but there's also something fitting about it. She didn't do the work for recognition. She did it because it was right, because pilots deserved aircraft that responded crisply and cleanly, because small improvements in engineering could mean the difference between life and death when young men were fighting in the thin, cold air above Europe. That was always what mattered to her, the work itself rather than the credit, the knowledge that she had contributed something real to a cause that was larger than herself. If you've stayed with this story until the end, I want to thank you for giving these 40 minutes to learn about a woman whose name should be better known, but isn't. Margaret Eleanor Hayes represents thousands of women who served during World War II, who made contributions that were crucial but forgotten, who proved that capability has nothing to do with gender and everything to do with insight and determination and the willingness to do what needs doing regardless of the obstacles. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the hidden figures in history whose work shaped our world, consider leaving a comment that simply says, "I'm with you until the end." It helps me know that these stories matter to you as much as they matter to me. And if you found value in this video, a like would be genuinely appreciated, not for the algorithm,